we've had a discussion series where we've been going through James's letters to the Christians. It's called The Essential James, the name of the series, and we've been discussing some ideas in there. And kind of throughout the entire series, what we're discussing is simply this idea, is that faith comes fully alive when beliefs and behaviors fully align. And I want you to kind of put a pin in that idea, because again, today we're really going to expound on this even more. But last week we had a guest speaker, Jason, who was here with our laundry project, and we partnered with him to take over a laundromat for 3 hours, and we had an amazing day last week, and I was really excited for him to share with you guys. And his from chapter 1, he looked at a section on faith and endurance and suffering, and he said that how we respond to what happens to us is an act of faith. It shows, it reveals what we believe based on how we respond to the things that happen to us in life, and we all go through rough things in life. But like I said, we're going to put a pin in that idea of that faith comes fully alive when our beliefs and behaviors fully align, because today in chapter 2, we're going to see that James kind of hits on this idea again. He kind of, in chapter 1, he talks about our mirror illustration here where truth needs action, right? We talked about that, and it's like looking at the Bible and listening to the Word of God is like looking in a mirror, and we need to do something about what we see in the mirror in and of ourselves. And so he's going to take that a step further and really talk about some words like belief and behavior, or good works, good deeds, and faith. And this was a really controversial idea even in the first century. Because the idea was, how are people made right with God? This is what they were trying to figure out after the Jesus stuff happens and this church starts. And then the church was predominantly Jewish people. And then people who were not Jewish started to come into this. And they started to, and so the Jewish people were like, okay, cool. Like, you trust in Jesus and you have faith in Jesus. That's awesome. But you also need to have these other things that the Jewish people, these laws that were very important to their culture and to their religion. They were trying to make Gentile people who weren't Jewish obey these Jewish laws and trust Jesus. And so it was this big controversy, because basically a Gentile man being told he had to have circumcision at age 30 to be right with God was going to be like, nah, never mind. And so it caused this really big discussion. And so all these church leaders got together, and it was the idea of, how are people made right with God? And the decision was, it's through faith in Jesus Christ alone. That's how people are made right with God. And so James, he doesn't necessarily not acknowledge that, but he kind of takes it a step further. So if the question is, are we made right by good works, or are we made right by faith, or by grace through faith, James would say yes. Yes. They're not mutually exclusive. They're together. And so he's going to expound on this. And I really think this is just some of the most important, beautiful things that James talks about in the entire letter that he writes to these Jewish Christians. And remember, he is writing to Jewish people. So to explain this, he's going to use 2 illustrations. One of them is going to be about a guy by the name of Abraham. And Abraham was like the start of it all when it comes to the Jewish people, to their family nation. He was like the grandfather, the godfather, the guy, right? Like Abraham. And then he's going to talk about a prostitute from a foreign country. And I love that the spectrum is there, right? Because he's going to talk about examples of faith, and he's going to talk about like the example of faith in their culture, and then he's going to talk about a prostitute from a foreign country. So first off, he mentions Abraham and Isaac. And I want to kind of give you a backstory if maybe you're not familiar with the story of Abraham and Isaac. So Abraham was this guy. He lived in a country called Ur. And he was called out of that country. And he believed that God called him to a place, but he didn't tell him where that place was. He said, I want you to go in this direction, and I'll tell you when you get there. Right? Like, that's some real faith. That's not really seeing, right, where you're going. Like, he didn't know. And so through all of this, we see Abraham get it wrong over and over, right? Because faith and uncertainty are like brothers, right? They're the flip side of a coin. And so he's uncertain about things, so he tries to take control over here and take control over there. And he's told that he's going to be the father of a great nation, but he and his wife can't have kids. And so he tries to have kids with like somebody else, and that causes all kinds of problems that are still going on today, by the way. So you think your sin has ripple effects? It's not quite like Abraham. And this uncertainty causes him to try and take control, but God is faithful to him and his promise to him. And we actually see that in their old age, they have this miracle baby, Isaac. So it's Abraham and Sarah, and they had their son, Isaac. He's also part of like, kind of like the triad of the father figures, the patriarchy of the Jewish nation. And one day, Abraham believes God is telling him to sacrifice Isaac, to kill him on an altar on a mountain. Now, we would hear that and we'd get very, very confused, right? Like, a God would act, like, that's not consistent with what we know of God and the rest of the Bible. Why would he ask Abraham to kill Isaac? That doesn't even make sense. And what's really great about it is if you look at it in its context, it actually brings out some new light. So Abraham was from Ur, which had a pantheon of gods, right? Like, they had a lot of gods for this, gods for that, gods for this, gods for that, and they had all these. And whenever something wasn't happening, so say you needed crops to grow, but the God of rain wasn't sending rain from the sky, what would you do? Well, you would sacrifice, right? You would try and give to this God, right? And the greatest sacrifice that kind of the community would decide to give would be child sacrifice. This was pretty common in ancient cultures. So the idea that a God, again, because for Abraham, he was just a God, because he had all these other gods too, so it was a God. So for a God to ask for your child in sacrifice wasn't that uncommon to Abraham. This is something he would have understood to be perfectly normal. Probably very difficult, right? In his old age, this miracle child. And this is like the promise. This is like the revelation of the promise that God had given him that he was so uncertain about. But, okay, God wants, so they march up a mountain. You think you've ever had a day with your parents where things just didn't go right? Imagine Isaac walking up the mountain. He even asked, hey, where's like the lamb that we normally sacrifice? Like, where's the animal? He's like, oh, God's going to provide. God's going to provide. And then when he starts tying up Isaac, you're probably thinking, hey, like, hold on, am I the lamb? And then he lays him down. And then we see in the story that God stops him from killing Isaac and actually provides another sacrifice. And we know this to be a picture, right? A forward picture of what we see in the New Testament through Jesus, of God giving his only son for the world. That this God, the point of that story is simply this, is that this God doesn't want your children. He's willing to give you his children to be right, and in right relationship with you. Right? It was this radical turn of events from the way Abraham understood the gods to be to what this God is that this God has flipped the script from every other God. And so this important moment in the life of Abraham and Isaac, James refers to here when he says, don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see, his faith and his actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete. And so it happened just as the scriptures say. Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous or right in right relationship because of his faith. He was even called a friend of God. So you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. He's trying to communicate and illustrate to them that, hey, you can say you have this belief, but your actions, your behaviors, your deeds, your works are in concert with that faith. And so we kind of see this as faith works best when shown, not all alone. Right? We get this in our culture. One of the biggest, I would say, backlash against Christianity or quote-unquote evangelicals in our current country, in the state that it is in, is simply this. We know what your Jesus says to do, and that's not what you do. Right? He talked earlier in chapter 1 about the law, the perfect law, and he repeats it in chapter 2 early on, the perfect law that sets you free. And we talked about that law being love God and love others as you love yourself. People know that. Like in our country, right? Like they've been given just enough Jesus to not really like Jesus people. And they know what we're supposed to do if you say you follow Jesus, you have faith in Jesus. But we don't do it. That's one of the biggest backlashes. And I think that the church needs a radical change, right? To where our actions and our faith are aligned. And that is when we begin to gain influence on the community and the culture around us. But then he gives another story, right? So there's Abraham, right? The father of faith, like this, the father of the Jewish nation, like this was a big deal. And then he's going to talk about Rahab, the prostitute from a foreign land. You see, later on in the history, as the Jewish people have grown and they've left Egypt and they had this promised land, and then they didn't really believe God. So God was like, okay, well then this generation isn't going to get that promised land. I'm going to give it to the next generation. A lot of lessons in those stories. Book of Exodus in the Old Testament, or the Torah, is just full of those great stories and lessons for us as we live our life. So that next generation is going to get to go into this promised land. But there's people that occupy the promised land. These people are very against the God of the Jewish nation. And the Jewish nation was there. They had to go to Egypt during a famine, and God wanted to take them back. And so we find the city Jericho, and Joshua, who is commanding the armies at that time of the Jewish nation, he sends in some spies. And they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we beat these guys? How do we take over this land? Are they going to be friendly to us? Maybe they just let us occupy together. Like what's going to go on here, right? And Jericho is known for these high walls. Maybe you're familiar. Maybe you went to Sunday school growing up and you remember the march around Jericho and actually how it happened. But before that, these spies go in. And they go into the house of a prostitute to seek refuge because it seems like they've been found out. And then someone tells the leaders, hey, they're in Rahab's house, in her brothel. And so Rahab hides them, and she makes this deal with them. She hides them. She's like, listen, everyone here in the city has heard about your God, and we are terrified. We heard the miracles that happened when you came out of Egypt. We get it. Your God is greater than all the other gods. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hide you guys. But you have to let me be saved when you take over the city. And they work out a deal and a plan with her. They say, listen, if you stick to your word, you will be saved. And so she hides them from the men. They stay there that night. And then they head back. And Rahab actually comes into the Jewish nation, into their history, into their family line. And if you look at the genealogy of Jesus, you actually find this outside foreigner prostitute who's in the very family of Jesus, in the direct line of Jesus. There's something huge, and there's some huge implications in that, in the idea of, sure, Abraham can be saved by faith, but Rahab also, this outsider, this prostitute, the last person that you would imagine and having an example of faith. But look at what James says. He says, Rahab the prostitute is another example, this spectrum. She was shown to be right with God by her actions when she hid those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. Just as the body is dead without breath, so also faith is dead without good works. It's the idea that faith is dead. It doesn't come alive. Sure, it's there, but it's dormant. It's not moving. It has no life to it. The word breath there can also be translated spirit. It's like the body without its spirit, right? It's consciousness. It's the thing that makes it unique and alive. The thing that makes you a person. And so today, if you're like, well, yeah, I believe in Jesus. I have this faith, but you don't live it out. There's a lifeless, dead body you're carrying around with you at all times. And it kind of gives us our idea worth discussing. Faith is action. You prove it when you do it. You prove it when you do it. He's not saying that they were made right with God by their actions. He was saying, no, they were shown to be right with God by their actions. They confirmed their relationship with God by their actions. And again, the action of loving God and loving your neighbor as you love yourself. That these actions matter. It's one of the things that for me, it just in my past church experience, there was a big emphasis on knowing things, right? And believing the very, right things, right? Like, here's the things you need to believe. I mean, I grew up and I went to a Christian school. I went to a mega church. I went to Bible college, 3 different ones. Right? Like, I've worked in churches, and then there's this idea of you believe these very specific things, and then that's how you're right with God. And the emphasis of living your faith out gets diminished. And look at what James says. Before he sets up these stories of Abraham and Rahab, this is what he's telling the people in the letter. It's so important. He says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Now, someone may argue, some people have faith and others have good deeds. But I say, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. This is what Brene Brown, book I'm reading, Daring Greatly, she says this about life. She says, what we know matters, but who we are matters more. Being rather than knowing requires showing up. It does matter, like what you know, right? Information is good. It's not that it's a bad thing. We talked about that the first week. Information is a good thing. The right information is good. Truth is good. But what are you doing with it? What are you doing with that truth? And here's the question today. I want to ask each and every one of us. Who is God calling you to love? Is it Him? For some of you, the first step right now of faith may be a love for God, right? Believing, trusting God for the first time in your life. That's who He's calling you to love today. For others of you, it's a neighbor. It's someone. And you probably have that person in your mind because it's that person that drives you the most crazy in life. It may literally be a neighbor. Is God calling you to love that person? Or is God calling you to love yourself? We do a terrible job of loving our neighbor as ourselves if we don't love ourselves very well. We miss that sometimes. Oh, love God, love your neighbor. As you love yourself. So how are you loving yourself today? Maybe God's calling you to some self-love, to understanding your worth in Him. Maybe for the first time ever. I'm going to call the musicians up. They're going to play a song, and then we're going to jump into this important discussion today of faith and works and the combination. And the idea of faith is action. You prove it when you do it. But I also want to say one more thing. One of the things at Downtown Faith that we want to do, we want to help people follow Jesus into new life. And this new life of faith may be for you. That may be where you are today. You want to take that next step. But we also give people avenues with which to work in their faith, right? To help others, to love God, to love others, to love themselves. We give them avenues with which to serve. And on your connection card there's a box on the back that you can check that says, I want to get involved. For some of you, that may be your step today. Did you check that box and you volunteer to serve in some way here at Downtown Faith? That you get involved in the work that God is doing through Downtown Faith in downtown Las Vegas. We have places where we can plug you in. This is only the beginning. We want more discussion space, and we want more people, and we want more avenues to help our community by creating space to discuss life and faith, and you could be a part of that. And that may be the work that you do and the good deeds that you begin doing, and maybe a first step through Downtown Faith.